You're listening to the BBC World Service. Following the crisis in Ukraine, we're making some changes to our schedule. Next, we're bringing you an extended edition of NewsHour. For many of our other programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to NewsHour. Tonight from the BBC World Service in London, I'm Tim Franks. Hundreds of civilians killed according to Ukraine, hundreds of thousands forced to flee according to the UN. And today, for the first time since the Russian invasion, direct talks between the Ukrainian and Russian delegation. Optimism runs low.
These talks are being held as Russia continues to invade Ukraine. There does not appear to be a seriousness of purpose to these talks.
And what of the Russian military advance? Has this apparently slow pace and the fierceness of the resistance prompted a change of approach?
What we have now seen in the past 24 hours is Russia resorting to what you might call more crude tactics. Artillery fire, rocket fire, shell fire.
We'll bring you voices from across Ukraine and ask how much pressure the Russian economy might now be under. First the news.
Hello, I'm Chris Barrow with the BBC News. There's been intense fighting around Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, with the Russian military shelling an area close to a shopping complex in the city centre. The city remains under Ukrainian control. From Kiev, here's James Waterhouse.
It is possible to use the word Kiev has been calmer today. When the curfew was lifted this morning, people were able to reclaim some of the freedoms which were so quickly taken away 5 days ago. It led to queues outside supermarkets as people looked to replenish increasingly limited supplies before heading back underground. For now, US officials think Russia's advance has slowed. There's been a second day of heavy fighting from Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, in the northeast. Authorities there say dozens have been killed after residential areas were shelled. There are protests in the port city of Verdansk after Russian troops took over. Meanwhile, talks have finished between Ukrainian and Russian negotiators close to the border with Belarus. We don't yet know the outcome, but expectations are low.
An emergency session of the UN General Assembly, which is discussing the Ukraine crisis, has heard calls for an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, said it was chilling that Russia's nuclear forces had been placed on high alert. Neda Tawfiq is in New York.
This special emergency session was called because on Friday, the Security Council failed to act. Russia vetoed a draft resolution presented by the U.S. In that body, the one that is supposed to maintain international peace and security. And so the Security Council quickly called for this GA meeting. In the General Assembly, we are going to be having speeches from more than 100 members over the next few days. And Western nations are hoping by Wednesday that by then they'll have overwhelming support for a draft which does condemn Russia.
President Putin has banned all residents of Russia from transferring hard currency abroad as he tries to reverse a record low in the value of the Russian currency. He's also forcing exporters in Russia to hold at least 80% of their revenue in rubles as international sanctions targeting Russian financial institutions intensify. The unprecedented sanctions have put some of Russia's foreign currency reserves, worth more than $600 billion, off limits. In the latest move, Britain's Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said there'd be a full asset freeze within days on all Russian banks.
Putin's war could end up lasting for months and years. So I say to our Ukrainian friends, we're with you. In Britain and around the world, we're prepared to suffer economic sacrifices to support you. However long it takes, we will not rest until Ukraine's sovereignty is restored.
This is the BBC World Service. I'm Chris Barrow with the latest world news from the BBC. The oil giant Shell has announced that it's quitting all of its Russian operations in response to the Ukraine invasion. These include its stake in a flagship liquefied natural gas plant, which is half owned by the Russian energy giant Gazprom. It's the latest major Western energy company to exit Russia. The African Union has condemned reports that African citizens who've been living in Ukraine are being stopped from crossing the border to reach safety. A statement from the AU said all people had the right to cross international frontiers during conflict. It described reports that Africans were being blocked as shockingly racist and a breach of international law. Football's world and European governing bodies, FIFA and UEFA, have suspended from international competitions all of Russia's national and club football teams for invading Ukraine. From Wembley Stadium is our sports editor, Dan Rowe.
Tonight, Russia finds itself effectively in international sporting pariah. FIFA had lots of criticism for allowing Russia to continue playing football, albeit with a different name, no flag or anthem, and on neutral venues. That meant that it could be possible for Russia to appear here at Wembley during the Women's Euros this summer and at the Men's World Cup later this year as well, despite national associations like the FA saying that they didn't want anything to do with Russia. FIFA acted along with UEFA, who also have ended their lucrative sponsorship arrangement with the Russian state-controlled energy giant Gazprom as well.
Ships using Egypt's Suez Canal will have to pay more from Tuesday. Tolls for the canal, which connects the Mediterranean and Red Sea, are to rise by as much as 10%. The news comes at a time of growing inflation in many countries, with even bigger increases in oil and gas prices likely in Europe due to the ongoing Ukraine crisis. I'm Chris Barrow, and for now, that's the latest BBC News.
Hello and welcome to News Hour. It's live from the BBC World Service studios in central London. I'm Tim Franks. Day 5 of Russia's Ukraine invasion and a day of furious bombardment in some places, notably Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv in the east. Sound of missiles falling in the distance, but it was quite an intense bombardment of rockets, and we'll be hearing from Kharkiv in about 30 minutes. We also got reports of increasing numbers of civilian casualties of a slow Russian advance towards the capital Kiev. That's with the aim of encircling it, along with some very loud bangs, sinking fell, and of Russian troops occupying new territory in the south. There was footage of Ukrainian residents surrounding and berating those Russian soldiers in the city of Berdyansk, waving Ukrainian flags in their faces. Well, that was on the military side. There was also a new front to the diplomatic action. A Ukrainian delegation sitting across a long and narrow table from a Russian delegation close to the Ukrainian border with Belarus. Those talks have broken up now, but there appears to have been an agreement at least to hold more talks. Progress of the most minuscule, but still perhaps welcome sort. There was a more public and angry exchange of views at the UN General Assembly in New York for the emergency session on the crisis. One of the speakers was the Ukrainian ambassador. He read out a series of text messages he said had been taken from the smartphone of a young Russian soldier who had been killed in the fighting. The messages, which are his mother.
We were told that they would welcome us, and they are falling under our armored vehicles, throwing themselves under the wheels and not allowing us to pass. They call us fascists. Mama, this is so hard. And this is several moments before he was killed.
For his part, the Russian ambassador Vasily Nebenzia said Ukraine itself was to blame for the current situation. He said that the country had refused to give special status to the Donbass region, which has an ethnic Russian population.
The root for the current crisis lies in the actions of Ukraine itself. For many years it sabotaged and flouted its direct obligations under the Minsk package of measures. Just recently there was hope that in Kiev they would reconsider and that they would indeed comply with what they had signed on to back in 2015. However, the latest confirmation from the senior leadership of the country was that Ukraine was unwilling to engage in this dialogue and unwilling to take steps to grant special status to Donbass.
And there are also further developments in the attempt to squeeze the Russian economy. One telling detail, perhaps Switzerland, that historically neutral country rather, a key financial hub, has emphatically joined sides today. It's announced it's adopting the same sanctions that the European Union has already imposed against Russia. These are some of the things we'll be looking at over the next hour. First, those talks on the Ukrainian-Belarusian border between a delegation from Kiev and one from Moscow. The BBC's Sergei Goryashko is in our Moscow bureau. Sergei, what information have you been able to gather about those talks?
Well, we know that the talks went without any major decisions like the ceasefire or some agreements. So the only thing that the parts did agree to is to continue talking tomorrow. And in this case, there are assumptions that probably Russian army would try to put itself in a more strong position till tomorrow, like encircling the Ukraine's capital Kiev, or probably taking some more major cities in Ukraine to make their position, to make Ukrainians more negotiable, like to make them surrender and to agree to those terms. It's also clear that in terms of what Russia wants, we could read that in a statement made by Kremlin after the previous call to French President Macron. And at those talks, Putin told that Russia wants West to acknowledge the sovereignty of Crimea, or that Russia is that Crimea is Russian territory. Also, they still want this demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, and some security guarantees as well.
Well, still maximalist demands in that case. Sergei Goryashko from BBC's Moscow bureau, thank you very much. No one knows where, when, how this war will end, but many people do seem to agree that it will leave Europe's geopolitics seriously shaken, perhaps fundamentally reshaped. Much has been made of the role of the transatlantic NATO military alliance, but there's another, much less high-profile security body which is supposed to embrace East and West. It's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, comprised of 57 member states. Indeed, their monitors have been working in eastern Ukraine since conflict there broke out in 2014. Michael Carpenter is the US ambassador to the OSCE. What's the latest picture he has of the current fighting?
Well, our assessment is that there's intense fighting, but the Ukrainian resistance has blunted the Russian offensive. Of course, Russia maintains immense amounts of combat power inside Ukraine and on the borders. There is still a significant amount that has not gone into Ukraine, although more than half is already in the country. The Ukrainians have fought valiantly. They're defending their homeland, and their determination and grit and their employment of the weapons that they do have has been to good effect, and they have certainly blunted the offensive on Kyiv and around Mariupol and in other parts of the country.
The OSCE has been very active in Ukraine over the past 8 years. Is there still an active mission? Are OSCE observers still trying to gather intelligence, or have most of the observers pulled out?
At this point, the mission has been evacuated. There are still some monitors who are sheltering in place because the circumstances do not allow for their departure. But it is the expectation of the chief monitor that they will be withdrawn as soon as is feasible.
The OSCE, I mean, I obviously don't need to tell you because you're the US ambassador, but nonetheless, I'm going to read out from its mission statement. It says that it's the world's largest regional security organization. It works for stability, peace and democracy for more than 1 billion people through political dialogue, and on it goes. How far do you accept that the events that we are witnessing in Ukraine are essentially an admission of failure? The OSCE hasn't been able to do anything to prevent this explosion in violence.
We've had a complete paradigm shift over these last 5 days with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But this is not a failure of the OSCE, just to be clear. The OSCE as a platform for dialogue and diplomacy has also been valuable on many occasions in the past.
But not in Ukraine, and not now.
Yeah, well, the fact that President Putin has decided, in spite of all the offers of dialogue and diplomacy and willingness to entertain serious conversations about confidence building and transparency and some of the other things that he claimed that he was interested in pursuing, the fact that he discarded all of that and decided to invade Ukraine is not the fault of the OSCE. I mean, let's be very clear. This is the fault of the Russian Federation, no one else. Well, Belarus, but no one aside from those two parties.
Do you think that there has been, though, a bit of a failure of imagination? I understand that Western intelligence...
No, I don't.
No, if I could just put the question, I mean, that Western intelligence certainly did say, look, we fear that he is going to be launching an invasion, but do you think that concerted enough efforts were made to try and, in a sense, get ahead of that, to prevent that?
Absolutely, they were. Look, we've spent the bulk of the last 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks, if not longer, warning that there was the possibility that Russia would invade Ukraine. And we also undertook very serious efforts to entertain those Russian concerns that we saw as, if not legitimate, at least something that we could discuss. For example, as I said earlier, confidence building and military transparency. But ultimately, if President Putin wanted NATO to say that we will never accept new members, or for NATO to pull its equipment and personnel from the territory of NATO allies, those were requests that we could not fulfill because they violate our core principles. So at the end of the day, let's be very clear. This is Russia's aggression. Russia is responsible. Let's point the finger where the finger needs to be pointed.
Indeed, I'm not ascribing responsibility or blame. You clearly are, and that is your job.
I am.
May I ask, in terms of taking Vladimir Putin's threats at face value, and he certainly made lots of threats before he decided to invade Ukraine, what has changed over the last couple of days is his language over nuclear weapons. And there are those who have worked with Mr. Putin, who say they have observed him at close quarters, who say you should be, i.e. the rest of the world, should be taking his new language on nuclear weapons very seriously and at face value. Is that something that you would advise?
Well, look, the Russian Federation has put its forces on a heightened state of alert. It is not the highest state of alert, but it's still escalatory and it's still concerning. My only comment is this: the United States is prepared to defend the homeland and its allies, or extended deterrence is effective, and we stand by.
May I just ask one final question, which is that there are these peace talks that are carrying on as I speak to you ahead of the program going out. They've been broken up by the time we're on it, between Russia and Ukraine. Is there any ground for optimism there? Is there anything, I mean, it's clear what Ukraine wants in terms of a ceasefire and the withdrawal of Russian troops. Is there anything that you can think that Ukraine might be able to offer Russia to try and get out of this unholy mess?
These talks are being held as Russia continues to invade Ukraine. So, unfortunately, there does not appear to be a seriousness of purpose to these talks. I mean, we would expect that Russia would immediately halt its offensive, immediately halt its bombing and the deaths of innocent civilians that bombing is causing, and then to have a serious discussion or a negotiation on the way forward. But Russia's not doing that. It's continuing its offensive, and that is very troubling.
That was Michael Carpenter, the U.S. ambassador to the OSCE, was visiting from his base in Vienna. You're listening to News Hour. Here from one member of the public in Ukraine who's decided to take up arms to fight Russian forces invading his country.
We are not fighting by ourselves. This is not a Ukrainian Russian war. This is a war against oppressive regime that is started as a Russian-Ukrainian war, but now it's a war between Russia and the civilized world.
This story in 30 minutes. Headlines this hour. There's been further intense fighting in Ukraine's second city, Kyiv, as the Russian invasion continues. And sirens have sounded again. The capital, Kyiv, will be in both cities in about 15 minutes. This is News Hour, live from the BBC. The United Nations Refugee Agency says more than 500,000 refugees from Ukraine have now fled into neighbouring countries following Russia's invasion last week. For many, though, the displacement is internal. With some of the most intense battles in eastern Ukraine as Russian troops try to advance across the country, there's been a wave of people fleeing back routes. Recently, across the night, several rates with reports.
Before this war, Maxine went to nursery, his mum had a job, and the whole family had a home in Volnovakha. Then Russian troops started to advance to Ukraine. Maxine's family have ended up right on the eastern front line. Nadezhda tells me she held out until a shell hit their neighbour's barn. A few meters further left, and she and the family wouldn't be here. They spent hours that night crouched in the bathroom for safety. The next morning, Nadezhda gathered up her family and fled. They're now in a student hostel here, living off handouts.
We're ashamed. I never thought we'd be in this situation. We were normal people. We have jobs, schools, a normal family. And now we have to ask for help. And the scariest thing is we don't know how long this is for, and whether we will have anything left to go back to. Her friend Miller tells me whenever a door bangs, she thinks it's an explosion, and that she should grab the children and run for cover. Nadezhda spends a lot of time now scrolling through her phone, anxious for news of friends and relatives she left behind. She tells me she feels guilty every day. There's a chat group that people post to when they emerge from their bunkers to check for bomb damage before darting back underground. We can't get near Volnovakha safely now, but these stories are a reminder of the fierce fighting here in the east, and that Russian forces are gaining ground. As the children run rings around a table piled with donated biscuits and pickles and buckwheat, I think Yelena, who tells me Ukraine will win this war. When I counter that I'm afraid Vladimir Putin hasn't even started yet, Yelena kicks me off. Just let him try, she tells me. But across town, more volunteers are greeting more families seeking shelter, this time in a bar. The concert hall upstairs has been carpeted with soft mats, and there are piles of donated clothes and toys for the children. As we were talking to one family here, another one just came through the door with all their bags and their belongings, and with their dog, a black collie. And there's one girl in front of me as well, rolling around on a play mat, who's hugging a grey cat called Sima, that she said she couldn't leave at home. Natalia lived right near the Russian border and fled with her children as soon as the town came under attack. Her 14-year-old son had to drive them. Her mother has just arrived at the shelter with news that key spots along the way have fallen to Russian forces. When I asked Natalia how she's coping, her eyes fill with tears. I try to keep it together, she tells me, because I don't want my children to see me cry. But she says she's still in shock that this war is even happening, and angry at Vladimir Putin. He first was defending us, but who from? By burning down our houses and our land? I asked if she feels safer now in Dnipro. For now, yes, it's calm here.
but my heart is shattered. My family has been pulled apart, and I'm frightened for my children. I just really want this to end. It's a nightmare.
But the danger is following her. As we finished speaking, an air raid siren wailed across the Dnipro for the first time, and a whole city, adults, children, and their pets, were driven underground.
Sarah Rainsford reporting from eastern Ukraine. So what can the West do to try to put the pressure on Russia, given that no country has said it's willing to join Ukraine's fight directly by sending its troops onto the battlefield? There does seem to be a real financial squeeze. The currency, the ruble, has been hammered today, falling to a record low. Britain's promised a full asset freeze on all Russian banks within days, and central banks around the world have appeared to pull off an unexpected and powerful move, certainly unprecedented for a G20 economy like Russia, freezing its foreign currency reserves. William Jackson is chief economist of emerging markets for Capital Economics. What does he think these sanctions will mean for Russia's economy?
Yeah, I think that the moves we saw over the weekend to agree on these new sanctions were really quite dramatic, and it took many people by surprise in how aggressive they are and how they are really honing in on some of the elements that make Russia's balance sheet look so strong. In particular, they targeted the central bank's foreign exchange reserves. There's close to $2.2 trillion of these reserves. The key point is that that's proven to have had a really strong effect on Russia today. We've seen the currency fall by about 20-25% against the dollar, and the central bank has been limited in its ability to stop the currency falling through intervening in the foreign exchange market.
Does it have other equity or other things that it can call upon? I mean, gold, for example, or reserves with China?
It does. The problem is that these are perhaps not as usable as other types of foreign exchange. Gold is very difficult to use in these circumstances. If customers at Russian banks are demanding to withdraw dollars from their accounts, you can't give them gold instead.
One of the other things that I was struck by today was the Swiss government announcing that it was going to adopt the same sanctions that the European Union has, which just, I don't know how significant it is in economic or financial terms, particularly in terms of those oligarchs who maybe have decided to stow their money in Swiss banks. But it just seemed symbolically quite important given Switzerland's history of neutrality and banking secrecy. What did you read into it?
It felt like a very big move from Switzerland. The Swiss government clearly didn't want to be seen to be perhaps shielding Russia.
We're talking on a very macroeconomic level at the moment. I wonder at what point we are likely to see all this feed into a squeeze on the Russian consumer, on inflation, on mortgages. When do you think this is likely to be felt on the Russian street?
I think it's going to be felt very soon. I think it's quite likely this inflation will jump to 15 to 20%. It's a very big rise. It's going to really hit households' incomes. At the same time, early this morning, the central bank raised interest rates from 9.5% to 20%. I think this is going to start hurting consumers quite quickly.
William, we began this interview by you remarking on just how concerted and strong these sanctions have been on Russia. One sector that has escaped, and clearly it's because Europe in particular relies so much upon imports from Russia, is the energy sector and oil and gas. How much can Russia, do you think, continue to rely on that as a source of income and also perhaps as a means of leverage over the West?
Yeah, this is really the area that's been carved out in all the sanctions is the energy trade, because, as you say, European countries are very dependent on Russian gas. That being said, there's clearly been a shift by European governments towards recognising that they need to reduce their dependency on Russian energy and to stop Russia being able to use this as leverage.
And that was William Jackson, Chief Economist of Emerging Markets with Capital Economics, a macroeconomic consulting research firm. Much more to come on this in the next segment. Stay with us if you can.
This is the BBC World Service, opening the door into Thailand,
spirit world.
Even the invisible residents of cities, towns, and villages need somewhere to live.
Today, we are conducting a housewarming ceremony and building a new spirit house.
They range from simple wooden structures to ornate white and gold palaces.
We believe that other planes of existence exist among ours. It might be that the elders or the residents that have once lived on this land reside in this house. We pay respect to them with this shrine.
I'm Tara Chalchnavez. I was born and raised in Bangkok. And for Heart and Soul, I'm finding out how these tiny houses unify believers and non-believers, Christians and Buddhists alike, and what they tell us about Thai spirituality.
An estate agent for spirits, Sunday at 10:30 GMT.
News now. The next 30 minutes we'll get the latest from Kiev with our correspondent Easter Set. Here from a resident in the city of Kharkiv under renewed Russian bombardment. Ask what the shift and hardening of Russian military tactics could mean. Get stories of those who've been forced to flee abroad. And hear the young Ukrainian man who says he has decided to take up arms after this sunny days.
BBC News with Chris Barrow. There's been intense fighting around Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, with the Russian military shelling an area close to a shopping complex in the city centre. The regional governor said 11 people have been killed and dozens wounded. The city remains under Ukrainian control. There have been calls for an immediate ceasefire. At an emergency session of the UN General Assembly, Ukraine's ambassador accused Russian forces of committing war crimes. Russia's representative blamed the crisis on Ukraine. The two countries have held their first face-to-face talks since the invasion of Ukraine 5 days ago. Negotiators are now consulting their leaders, but plan to meet again. Turkey says it's implementing the terms of an international agreement that allow it to restrict warships passing through Turkish waters, linking the Black Sea with the Mediterranean. This follows a request from Ukraine. President Putin has banned all Russian residents from transferring hard currency abroad. He wants to reverse the plummeting value of the ruble after biting international sanctions. The oil giant Shell is quitting all of its operations in Russia. These include its stake in its flagship liquefied natural gas plants and its involvement in the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline linking Russia with Germany. All of Russia's national and club football teams have been suspended from international competitions by FIFA and UEFA. The national sides have been due to take part in the World Cup playoffs next month. In other news, Sudanese security forces have opened fire and used tear gas in a bid to disperse large crowds of protesters calling for an end to military rule. More than 80 people have been killed since a coup last October. Police in Mexico are looking for the bodies of 17 people reportedly murdered during a wake. It happened in a state that's at the centre of a battle for control between rival criminal gangs. BBC News.
Okay, we're back to news coming up shortly. We'll hear from Kiev and Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, which is faced particularly intense bombardment from Russian forces there. Let's have a quick look there at another big story today. A major UN report on climate change. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres called it an atlas of human suffering where the abdication of leadership is criminal. Professor Daniela Schmidt is the coordinating lead author to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
I think it's really important to hear that message that climate change impacts us there. Climate change is not for the future. I think it's also important in this finding in the report that these risks will accelerate, will widen the more warming we will see on this planet. And it is a real threat to human well-being.